Hey, Leigh-Ann, it's good to connect with you again. Um, so late last year, your nonprofit Aire Ventures released the results of its REDI scorecard on diversity in South Florida's tech community. What was the goal of the scorecard and what were your main findings?
Ashley, thanks so much. It's great to be with you again as well. And I think that's a good place to start in terms of the Ready scorecard. And I wanna make sure that I make clear that the Ready scorecard is really just a tool. Yes, Air Ventures led the charge and kind of doing a lot of the legwork, but really this was a collaborative effort among well over 80 local partner organizations that range from accelerators, incubators, investors, local government, all organizations that make up the tech and innovation ecosystem in South Florida. But ultimately, what we wanted to discover was where could we have a clear strategy for more of a ready, so racially equitable, diverse, and inclusive growth of our ecosystem. I mean, everybody knows in the last 18 months or so, South Florida in particular, Miami specifically, has seen a huge influx of newcomers into the Miami tech ecosystem. A group of us, about a year ago put together the Miami Tech Manifesto. But when an ecosystem like South Florida is in such a growth stage, it was really important to understand how we can be strategic to leverage the opportunity so that people weren't left behind. But what was missing is we didn't have data. We really didn't have a comprehensive assessment that allowed us to understand what were the gaps, where were there opportunities, what was the sentiment analysis around whether or not the resources that existed in our community were actually going to trickle down to folks that needed them the most? Where were we on talent? How did tech founders and other ecosystem stakeholders feel about the level of support local government was providing? So there was a whole host of questions that we needed to answer that we didn't see data on. So we created the Ready Scorecard as a framework.
What is the data telling you about South Florida at this point?
I think for us, they substantiated a lot of what we knew anecdotally. So, in talking to founders and hearing from people, as you recall, Ashley, our organization used to run the Venture Cafe. So, over a 5 year period, we served over 50,000 innovators. So, it's not like we didn't have our ear to the ground. But a couple findings that stand out to me in particular was that women entrepreneurs and Black ecosystem leaders lacked effective support specifically in the ecosystem. So that means, yes, we have a lot of opportunities, there's a lot of resources, but they were not necessarily trickling down to everybody that needed them. In nearly all categories and subcategories, women entrepreneurs rated the ecosystem lower than their male counterparts. I think it was upwards of over 20% lower. And then Black ecosystem leaders and Black business support leaders rated the ecosystem over 40% lower than their white and Hispanic peers. So that was a huge kind of disparity that was instructive of how we can build going forward. Another initial finding was that South Florida networks, by and large, lack diversity and sometimes are difficult to access without the right connections. And so that what that means is we can then invest more in more effective ways to distribute social capital and connections. Because the reality is, we've always been a who you know kind of culture in a city. But that means if we're not expanding and diversifying who we know, certain people get locked out of opportunities. On the positive side, what I thought was really fascinating is that there was a lot of data that identified that South Florida wants to have a clear identity of where we sit in the world as an ecosystem. And one clear point was like, we're not Silicon Valley 2.0. We have a unique value proposition, which we often point to, that calls for us to create a cohesive identity around branding, marketing, and attracting newcomers to our ecosystem. And then finally, one that was really helpful was that there are a lot of low cost programs that are available to entrepreneurs and founders that are looking to grow and scale their businesses. We have a dearth. Now, where the opportunity exists is to make sure that those pathways are more structured and bespoke. And so that if you are a founder at an early stage, you can easily access early stage specific resources, or if you're at a growth stage, it's much easier to access growth stage specific resources. And finally, the question that's always on everybody's mind. I know City of Miami Mayor Francis Suarez is always promoted and hyped up for making Miami the capital of capital. Well, one of the findings of the scorecard is we need to make the capital that's here more accessible to underrepresented groups and underrepresented founders. And so we saw that there was record growth in the amount of venture capital deployed over the last year and a half, 18 months. And you've been tracking it with your reporting at the South Florida Business Journal, as well as in the Inno newsletter. But we are not tracking quite well who that capital is going to and whether or not it's going to the groups that are traditionally underrepresented, like women and like people of color, in particular, Black entrepreneurs, which represent a racial and ethnic minority in our majority minority demographic landscape.
And you mentioned that one of the responses that you had from Black and women founders was they didn't feel quite as, supported right now in, South Florida's tech ecosystem. What can be done to make those founders feel more supported?
So that's a great question. I think phase one of the REDI scorecard has been let's show the data. Let's identify some of the gaps, understand where our challenges are. And I think phase two, which is more of a community effort as well, is to really identify those types of solutions that are solving for these gaps in a way that is authentic and has efficacy. And so, yes, we need more funding. We need more checks to go to those that are not represented, that are not getting checks. But I also think one of the biggest challenges is finding where the other barriers might exist. And I see that in the results of the scorecard and some of the data, we're able to see where some of the barriers also exist. So one of the challenges that I just mentioned was the dense networks. How you get to a venture capital deal is often the result of who you know. So one of the ways that we can remove some of these barriers to access to capital would be in creating more high value networks for the groups that are traditionally underrepresented. Another opportunity that we have here in particular is to look at what types of supports are missing. And so in the REDI scorecard data, we break down different types of supports beyond just, oh, you need supports. We break it down in terms of talent, pipeline, and mentorship, champions and ecosystem builders, policy supports, specifically those on-ramps and pathways, intersections, conversations, metrics and learning, and identity and storytelling. So those, at least those basic categories, are a couple of ways that we could focus on more specific strategies to remove barriers. One might be policy supports in other ecosystems, emerging markets. Local government is getting really creative about ways that they can leverage some public dollars to make capital more accessible in grant funding or in match funding or in sponsoring opportunities for entrepreneurs to get more access to mentorship and supports. Another area where we saw some distinctions between women and men and people of color across disaggregated racial groups was on talent pipeline and mentorship. And so we did see some talent placement gaps where diverse talent was having trouble connecting to worthwhile companies, but also in terms of mentorship. And so mentorship around scaling up is an area where we can invest more of our resources and our energy and our efforts to help these folks that are unfortunately being left behind.
What has the response been from local government since the REDI scorecard was released?
The response has been relatively positive for those representatives of local government that we've had an opportunity to personally interact with. I know most of the major municipalities, at least in Miami-Dade County, have sent representatives to our initial open walkthroughs that we held in December. And so we're actually going to be doing more efforts to engage with local government so that they're aware of the scorecard, because the timing of when it was released is pre-Basel, right before the Christmas and winter holiday season. And so I think people kind of slowed down towards the end of the year. But as we pick up the year, I do anticipate we'll see more opportunities to partner, more opportunities to walk through walkthroughs individually with local government, Many mayors have individually said, I want to do a walkthrough with my team to truly dig into the data and understand how this can inform our strategy, from Francis Suarez specifically, as well as Daniela Levine Cava at the county. And so that's positive because at the end of the day, the scorecard is just a tool that ideally can be leveraged by local government in their efforts to play a role in building an inclusive ecosystem and also in how they attract talent, companies, and newcomers to our ecosystem. So it's designed to be a tool that they can leverage.
What advice would you offer women founders or Black founders who are trying to raise funding and build here in South Florida, especially if they haven't necessarily had success with traditional fundraising? What other avenues are there?
So I think that sometimes founders get so focused on giving away their equity for an investment, but there are traditional ways of bringing on capital that they may just overlook because it's not as sexy, it's not as cool as saying, I got an investor and gave away my equity. I mean, the SBA has really interesting programs and really great programs that are available to any entrepreneur, any business. And by and large, kind of startup founders are really good at developing clear business plans. And so you could take on debt. There are also grant programs available. So sometimes it's just as much as doing research. If your project is social impact oriented, you can get philanthropic funding. And then most importantly, I would say, don't forget about revenue. You can, depending on the nature of your product or service, look at ways to generate revenue so that you are not just bootstrapping, but you're funding your business. Be clear about what you want funded and be clear about what you're going to do with the money. I often find in talking to founders who have not been successful at getting funding is they haven't really got clarity on how they're going to use the money and what they want to fund. And so having good relationships with investors and mentors and having people take a look at your deck or take a look at your pitch and giving you feedback will really help to refine the process.